The morning sun shone brightly over the tree-lined streets of Westview Heights. Jessica Reynolds took a deep breath as she parked her dark blue sedan in front of the community center where she had spent countless hours as a young girl. Though she now owned multiple homes around the world and could afford any luxury car, Jessica preferred driving this modest vehicle when visiting her old neighborhood. It kept her grounded, reminded her of where she came from. Today was special. After years of success in the tech world, building her company from a small startup to a billion-dollar enterprise, Jessica had returned to announce a major donation to renovate the aging community center. She checked her simple gold watch. She was early for the meeting with the center's director. Jessica stepped out of her car, smoothing down her elegantly tailored navy blue suit. At 42, she carried herself with quiet confidence. Her success hadn't changed her warm smile or the thoughtful way she looked at the world. The neighborhood had changed since her childhood days. Fancier cars parked along the streets, homes with fresh paint and landscaped gardens. Progress, she thought, though she worried about the families who might have been pushed out by rising costs. As Jessica gathered her portfolio from the passenger seat, a police cruiser pulled up behind her car, lights flashing but no siren. She turned, curious but unconcerned. Officer Blake Thompson stepped out, hand resting casually on his belt. He was tall with cold eyes that sized her up quickly, dismissively. "Ma'am, we've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," he said, his tone immediately setting Jessica on edge. "Good morning, officer," Jessica replied politely. "I'm just here for a meeting at the community center." She gestured toward the building behind her. Officer Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Can I see some identification? And what's your business here exactly?" The way he emphasized "your" made Jessica's stomach tighten. She'd experienced this before, the assumption that she didn't belong in certain spaces. "Of course," Jessica said, reaching for her purse. "I'm Jessica Reynolds. I grew up in this neighborhood, and I'm meeting with the director about a donation." She handed him her driver's license. Officer Thompson barely glanced at it. "Reynolds, huh? And you expect me to believe you have business at this address?" His disbelief was palpable, insulting. Jessica stood straighter. "You can call Director Wilson if you'd like. He's expecting me." A small crowd of morning dog walkers and joggers had begun to gather, watching the interaction with growing interest. Jessica felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from a familiar anger. After all she had accomplished, after building a tech empire that employed thousands, after donating millions to education and healthcare, she was still being treated like an outsider in her own hometown. "Listen, I don't have time for this," Officer Thompson said, handing back her license with visible reluctance. "Just move your vehicle. You can't park here." Jessica looked at the street signs. "There are no parking restrictions posted, officer." Something in Thompson's face hardened. "Are you arguing with me?" He stepped closer, his body language threatening. "I'm simply stating a fact," Jessica replied, keeping her voice level though her heart raced. She had faced down corporate rivals and skeptical investors, but the power dynamic here was different, dangerous. "You people always think you know better," Thompson muttered, loud enough for her to hear. Jessica felt her chest tighten at the unmistakable implication. "Excuse me." The officer's hand moved to Jessica's shoulder, shoving her roughly back toward her car. "I said move your vehicle. Now." The crowd gasped. Someone started recording with their phone. Jessica stumbled but caught herself, shocked at the physical contact. "Officer, you just assaulted me," she said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor." Officer Thompson stepped forward again, his face flushed with anger, when suddenly a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up alongside them. The back door opened and the crowd fell completely silent. No one could believe who stepped out next. The black SUV had been cruising through the neighborhood just moments earlier. Inside, Donald Trump checked his watch and glanced out the tinted windows. He was early for a private fundraising breakfast at the home of an old business associate who lived in this upscale area. His security team had suggested a different route, but Trump had insisted on driving through these streets. "I want to see how the neighborhood has changed," he told them. Trump had developed properties in this city years ago and felt a connection to the area. As they rounded the corner, his driver slowed down. Something was happening up ahead. A small crowd gathering around a police officer and a woman in a business suit. "What's going on there?" Trump asked, leaning forward in his seat. His security head frowned. "Just a police stop, sir. Nothing to worry about." But Trump's eyes narrowed as he watched the officer's aggressive stance and the woman's defensive posture. Then, as the SUV drew closer, he recognized her face. "That's Jessica Reynolds," he said, suddenly surprised. His assistant looked up from her tablet. "The tech CEO? Are you sure?" "Positive. I met her at that economic summit in Dallas last year. Brilliant woman. Built her company from nothing." Trump continued watching as the interaction between Reynolds and the officer grew more tense. Something's not right here. Then, to everyone's shock, they saw the officer shove Jessica backward. "Stop the car," Trump ordered immediately. "Right now." His security team protested. "Sir, we're already running behind schedule." "I said stop the car," Trump repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. As the SUV pulled to a halt, he was already reaching for the door handle. "Sir, please wait for us to secure," his head of security began, but Trump was already stepping out onto the sidewalk. The crowd that had gathered fell silent as they recognized the unmistakable figure emerging from the vehicle. Some pulled out their phones, already recording. A few whispered in disbelief. The morning sun caught Trump's distinctive hair as he straightened his red tie and assessed the situation with a quick glance. Officer Thompson turned away from Jessica, suddenly aware of the new arrival. His face showed a flash of recognition, followed quickly by confusion. What was Donald Trump doing here, in this neighborhood, on a random Tuesday morning? Jessica, still recovering from the officer's push, looked equally surprised. Her hand went to her phone instinctively. Was this really happening? Trump walked toward them with purpose, his security team scrambling to follow. His expression was serious but calm. He'd been in enough tense situations to know how to handle them. The small crowd parted to let him through, watching in amazement. "Good morning," Trump said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street. He nodded to Jessica first, then to the officer. "I couldn't help but notice there seems to be some trouble here." Officer Thompson straightened up immediately, his demeanor shifting. "No trouble, sir. Just a routine check." Jessica's eyes darted between them, still processing this unexpected development. "Mr. Trump," she said, finding her voice. "This officer was just questioning my right to be in this neighborhood." Trump's eyebrows raised slightly as he looked from Jessica to the officer and back. "Ms. Reynolds is one of our country's most respected business leaders," he said to Thompson. "I find it hard to believe there's any legitimate reason to question her presence anywhere." The onlookers murmured among themselves, phones still recording. This was turning into something none of them had expected to witness on their morning walks. Officer Thompson's face flushed red. "I was just responding to a call about suspicious activity." "And you found it suspicious that Ms. Reynolds was parked in front of a community center?" Trump asked, his tone measured but pointed. He turned to Jessica. "I believe we met at the Economic Forum in Dallas. Your speech about technology accessibility for underserved communities was impressive." Jessica nodded, still slightly stunned by the turn of events. "Yes, that's right. Thank you for remembering." The crowd was completely captivated now. None of them had expected their morning to include witnessing Donald Trump intervene in a confrontation between a police officer and one of the country's few female billionaires. And no one could have predicted what would happen next. Trump stepped closer to Officer Thompson, positioning himself supplely between the officer and Jessica. The crowd had grown larger now, with people from nearby houses coming out to see what was happening. Every phone was pointed their way, capturing this unexpected moment. "Look," Trump said in a quieter voice to Thompson, though still loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I understand you're doing your job, but I know Ms. Reynolds. She's one of our country's greatest success stories." Officer Thompson shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence evaporating under the scrutiny of so many eyes. "Sir, I was just following protocol." "Protocol includes pushing a citizen?" Trump asked, his eyebrows raised. He didn't wait for an answer. "I saw that from my car. That's not protocol, that's poor judgment." Jessica stood taller now, her composure returning. The initial shock of Trump's arrival was wearing off, replaced by a determination not to let this incident pass without addressing it properly. "Mr. President," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I appreciate your intervention, but this is unfortunately not an isolated incident. Many people face this kind of treatment daily without anyone stepping in." Trump nodded thoughtfully, turning to face both Jessica and the growing crowd. His security team had formed a loose perimeter, but they weren't interfering. This was turning into an impromptu public moment, and Trump seemed to recognize its importance. "You know," he said, speaking louder now so everyone could hear, "America is at its best when we treat each other with respect. When we recognize talent and hard work." He gestured toward Jessica. "Ms. Reynolds built her company from her garage. Started with nothing but a good idea and determination. Now she employs thousands of people and her technology helps millions. That's the American dream right there." The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone began to clap, and others joined in. Officer Thompson looked increasingly uncomfortable, caught between his earlier actions and the unexpected turn of events. "Officer," Trump continued, turning back to Thompson, "I think we have a teaching moment here. Sometimes we all make snap judgments based on what we see on the surface. I've been guilty of it myself, but that's not who we should be as Americans." A woman in the crowd called out, "Tell him, Mr. President." Trump raised his hand slightly, asking for quiet. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. We all make mistakes. The question is what we do after." Jessica stepped forward. "I'm not interested in escalating this situation. What I want is accountability and change." She looked directly at Officer Thompson. "Do you understand why your actions were problematic?" The officer's face flushed, but he met her gaze. For a long moment, no one spoke. The crowd waited, watching this unexpected confrontation unfold. Finally, Thompson nodded slightly. "I may have approached the situation with some preconceptions," he admitted reluctantly. Trump clapped him on the shoulder. "That's a start. Admitting when we're wrong isn't weakness, it's strength." He turned to Jessica. "Would you agree?" Jessica considered for a moment. "It's a beginning. Real change requires more than words." A man pushed forward from the crowd, the community center director, rushing over from the building. "Ms. Reynolds, I'm so sorry. I saw the commotion from my office window. Is everything all right?" He looked bewildered at the scene before him. Donald Trump, a police officer, and a growing crowd all gathered on his sidewalk. "Director Wilson," Jessica said with a nod. "We've had a bit of a situation, but I think we're working through it." She gestured to Trump. "I believe you know who this is." Wilson's eyes widened as he properly registered Trump's presence. "Mr. President, this is unexpected. We're honored, of course, but—" "No need for formalities," Trump said with a wave of his hand. "I was just passing through when I noticed Ms. Reynolds seemed to be having some trouble." He looked between Jessica and the director. "I understand you two have a meeting about a donation to this community center." Wilson nodded eagerly. "Yes, Ms. Reynolds has generously offered to fund our renovation and expansion project." Trump turned to Officer Thompson, whose expression had shifted from defensiveness to dawning realization. "Officer, did you know that Ms. Reynolds grew up in this neighborhood? That she's returning to invest in its future?" Thompson shook his head slowly. "No, sir, I didn't." "Perhaps," Trump suggested, "instead of asking Ms. Reynolds to leave, you might want to thank her for giving back to her community." The crowd had grown completely silent, watching this exchange with rapt attention. The morning sun was higher now, casting shorter shadows across the scene as this unexpected drama continued to unfold on their ordinary neighborhood street. What happened next would surprise them all. Officer Thompson cleared his throat, his eyes now focused on the ground. The crowd waited in tense silence for his response. When he finally looked up, his face had changed. The hard edges of authority had softened into something more human, embarrassment mixed with realization. "You're right, Mr. President," Thompson said quietly. "And Ms. Reynolds, I owe you an apology." He removed his cap, holding it against his chest, a gesture of sincerity that felt unplanned. "My actions were out of line. There's no excuse for how I treated you." Jessica studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity, but found none. She nodded slightly, acknowledging his words without fully accepting them yet. Director Wilson stepped forward, looking nervously between them. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation inside? The morning's getting warm, and we have fresh coffee in my office." Trump checked his watch. I'm running late for my breakfast meeting, but this seems more important. He gestured toward the community center's entrance. Lead the way, Director. As they walked toward the building, the crowd reluctantly began to disperse, though many lingered nearby, still recording with their phones. Trump's security team created a perimeter, maintaining a respectful distance while ensuring their protectees' safety. Inside the community center, the air conditioning was a welcome relief from the growing heat outside. The building showed its age, faded posters on corkboards, scuffed floors that had seen decades of use, ceiling tiles yellowed with time. But there was also warmth to it, photos of community events lining the walls, children's artwork proudly displayed. Director Wilson led them to his small office at the back, quickly clearing extra chairs from a stack in the corner so they could all sit. I never expected to host such distinguished guests today, he said, his hands slightly shaking as he poured coffee into mismatched mugs. Jessica accepted her coffee with a smile. This place hasn't changed much since I used to come here after school. Same coffee station, same chairs. Trump took a sip from his mug. Good coffee, strong, the way I like it. Officer Thompson sat stiffly in his chair, still holding his cap, looking unsure of his place in this impromptu meeting. So, Trump said, cutting through the awkward silence, Ms. Reynolds, you were saying you're making a donation to this center. Jessica nodded. Yes, $5 million to renovate the building and expand their programs. She glanced at Wilson. This place was my sanctuary growing up. When my mother was working double shifts, I'd come here to do homework, participate in their science club. Without this center, I wouldn't be where I am today. Wilson beamed. What Jessica isn't saying is that her donation is the largest in our history by far. We'll be able to renovate completely, add a computer lab, expand our after-school programs, and even offer coding classes. Trump looked impressed. That's fantastic. Community centers like this are the backbone of neighborhoods. Officer Thompson shifted in his seat, then finally spoke up. Ms. Reynolds, there's something you should know. He placed his cap on his knee and looked directly at her. The program you're funding, I'm actually scheduled to participate in it next week. Jessica's eyebrows raised in surprise. What do you mean? Thompson continued, his voice growing steadier. The police department recently partnered with this community center for an outreach program. Officers spend time with local kids, helping with homework, playing basketball, building relationships. I volunteered to be one of the first participants. He paused, the irony of the situation clearly not lost on him. I'm supposed to start next Tuesday. The room fell silent as the significance of this revelation sank in. Trump was the first to laugh, a genuine, surprised laugh that broke the tension. Well, isn't that something, he said, shaking his head. The officer giving you trouble is the same one who's going to benefit from your generosity. Jessica didn't laugh. Instead, she studied Thompson with new interest. Why did you volunteer for the program, officer? Thompson's answer came without hesitation. Because I grew up in a neighborhood not far from here. Things were rough when I was a kid. If I had a place like this, maybe my path would have been easier. He looked around the office. I joined the force to make a difference, but lately I felt disconnected from the community. This program seemed like a way to bridge that gap. Jessica nodded slowly, processing his words. And yet, when you saw me this morning, I made assumptions, Thompson admitted. I saw someone who I thought didn't belong instead of seeing a person. It's not the first time. Director Wilson looked between them, then spoke gently. Sometimes the universe has strange ways of bringing people together who need to meet. Outside the window, they could see the crowd still lingering, phones occasionally raised toward the building. Word had spread through social media, and local news vans were beginning to arrive. Trump glanced outside, then back at the three of them. I think what happens next is important, not just for the three of you, but for everyone watching. By afternoon, the video had gone viral. Millions of people watched the confrontation between Officer Thompson and Jessica Reynolds, followed by Donald Trump's unexpected intervention. News stations played the clips on repeat, social media erupted with hashtags, and talk show hosts were already booking experts to discuss the incident. Jessica sat in her downtown office, looking out over the city skyline. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since she'd left the community center. Calls from journalists, messages from friends, emails from business associates. Everyone wanted to know about her experience. She'd turned down 3 major network interview requests already, needing time to process everything that had happened. Her assistant knocked gently on the doorframe. "Your 4 o'clock is here." Jessica nodded, turning away from the window. "Send him in." The door opened, and a nervous-looking Officer Thompson entered, now in civilian clothes, jeans and a simple blue button-down shirt. Without his uniform and badge, he looked smaller somehow, more human. "Ms. Reynolds," he said, standing awkwardly until she gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me again." Jessica studied him, her expression neutral. "I thought we should talk away from the cameras. The whole world is watching now. Over 10 million views last I checked." Thompson nodded, running a hand over his short hair. "My captain called me in after the videos started circulating. I've been temporarily reassigned to desk duty while they conduct a review." "Is that standard procedure?" Jessica asked. "Yes, though," he hesitated. "I think it would have been swept under the rug if the videos hadn't gone viral, if the president hadn't been there." Outside Jessica's office, the city continued its normal rhythm. Cars humped in traffic far below, clouds drifted past the skyscrapers, people went about their day unaware of the conversation happening in this quiet room high above them. "I've been thinking a lot since this morning," Thompson continued when Jessica didn't immediately respond. "About why I acted the way I did. About patterns I've fallen into without even realizing it." Jessica leaned forward slightly. "And what have you concluded?" "That I've been seeing threats where there aren't any. That I've been letting assumptions color my judgment." He met her eyes directly. "I was wrong this morning. Not just about you specifically, but about my whole approach." Jessica nodded slowly. "Do you think you're the only officer who makes these kinds of assumptions?" "No," Thompson admitted. "It's common. More common than most of us want to admit." A news alert popped up on Jessica's computer screen. The police department had issued a statement about the morning's incident, promising a full investigation and review of training procedures. The mayor had chimed in too, calling for a community forum to discuss police-community relations. "Your actions have sparked quite a conversation," Jessica said, gesturing toward her screen. Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "I never wanted to be famous, especially not for this." "Few people choose how they become known to the world," Jessica replied. "What matters is what you do with the spotlight once it finds you." She stood and walked to a small table by the window, pouring 2 glasses of water. She handed one to Thompson before returning to her seat. "I grew up not far from where we met this morning," she said after taking a sip. "My mother worked as a hospital cleaner. We lived in a small apartment, and there were many nights when dinner was whatever she could cobble together from nearly empty cupboards." Thompson listened silently, perhaps surprised by this personal turn in the conversation. "The community center was my haven," Jessica continued. "They had free after-school programs while my mother worked evening shifts. The computers there were my first introduction to technology." She smiled faintly at the memory. "Old, donated machines that crashed half the time, but they opened up a whole new world for me." "That's why you're donating to the center," Thompson said, "giving back." Jessica nodded. "Yes, but it's more than that. I want to make sure other kids have the opportunities I did, better ones even. What happened this morning made me realize we need more than just new computers and renovated buildings." "What do you mean?" "We need to change how people see each other. How people like you see people like me when we're just going about our day." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The president was right about one thing: what we do next matters. Not just for us, but for everyone watching." Thompson set his glass down. "I want to do better. I just don't know where to start." "Actually," Jessica said, a hint of a smile forming, "I have some ideas about that." She reached for a folder on her desk and opened it. Inside were draft plans for a new initiative, one that would bring police officers and community members together in a much more meaningful way than occasional basketball games or homework help. "President Trump called this morning," she said, sliding the folder toward Thompson. "He wants to help. Said he was inspired by how the 3 of us found common ground despite our differences. He's offered to help fund this program alongside my donation." Thompson looked at the documents with growing interest. "This could actually work," he said quietly. This could really change things. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the city. But in Jessica's office, something new was just beginning to take shape. 3 months passed quickly. The community center hummed with activity as workers installed new computers, repainted walls, and upgraded the gym floor. The renovation was ahead of schedule thanks to the unexpected boost in funding after the viral incident. What had begun as an unpleasant confrontation had transformed into something no one could have predicted. Officer Thompson, Blake, as he now asked people to call him when he wasn't on duty, walked through the center's front doors carrying a box of donuts. He'd grown used to the double takes from some of the staff and regular visitors. Being recognized from a viral video that had over 50 million views was something he'd never planned for. "Morning, Blake," called the receptionist with a friendly wave. The meeting's already started in the conference room. Blake nodded his thanks and headed down the freshly painted hallway. Through the glass wall of the conference room, he could see Jessica leading a discussion with several police officers and community members. Her hands moved animatedly as she spoke, her passion evident even from a distance. He paused for a moment before entering, still sometimes struck by the strange turn his life had taken. 3 months ago, he had been just another patrol officer, going through the motions of his job with growing cynicism. Now he was the face of a new police training program that was drawing national attention. The door made a soft sound as Blake entered, and Jessica looked up with a smile. "Perfect timing," she said. "We were just discussing the results from last month's workshops." Blake set the donuts on the table and took the empty seat next to Chief Patel, his supervisor and unexpected ally in the new initiative. The chief nodded in greeting, then returned her attention to the presentation on the screen. "As you can see," Jessica continued, pointing to a graph, "the feedback scores from both officers and community participants show significant improvement in mutual understanding. 92% reported that the program changed their perspective in meaningful ways." The room hummed with positive energy. Around the table sat people who might never have spoken to each other 3 months ago: veteran officers, neighborhood activists, teachers, former inmates now working as mentors, all brought together by a chance encounter that could have gone very differently. "Blake," Jessica said, bringing him into the conversation, "would you like to share your experiences from the high school sessions?" Blake straightened in his chair. Public speaking had never been his strength, but he'd been doing a lot more of it lately. "Sure," he said, clearing his throat. "We've completed workshops at 3 high schools now. The students were skeptical at first. You could feel the tension when we walked in wearing our uniforms." He paused, remembering those first awkward moments. But the role reversal exercises broke the ice. Having the students put on police gear while explaining to us what it feels like to be approached by an officer, that created some really honest conversations. Chief Patel nodded. "The feedback from my officers has been surprisingly positive. Even the old-timers who thought this was going to be just another PR stunt are asking to participate." "The numbers back that up," Jessica said, clicking to the next slide. "We have a waiting list of officers volunteering for the program now. And applications for the police academy are up 30%, with more diverse candidates than ever before." A city council member raised her hand. "The mayor is getting calls from other cities wanting to implement this program. How scalable is this model?" Jessica smiled. "That's actually our next agenda item." She clicked forward to reveal a new slide titled National Expansion Plan. President Trump called again yesterday. He secured commitments from 3 major foundations to help fund pilot programs in 20 cities across the country. Murmurs of excitement filled the room. What had started as a local initiative was growing beyond anything they'd imagined. After the meeting, Blake helped stack chairs while Jessica gathered her materials. They'd developed an easy working relationship over the past months, the awkwardness of their first encounter long behind them. "I spoke to my brother yesterday," Blake said as they worked. "He's a surgeon in Philadelphia. Their department is interested in the program." Jessica nodded. "Add them to the list. We're receiving more requests than we can handle right now." Blake set the last chair against the wall and turned to face her. "Did you ever imagine that morning would lead to all this?" Jessica looked around the renovated room, then back at Blake. "Honestly, no. I came to donate money for new computers. I never planned to start a national movement. I never planned to be the poster boy for police reform, Blake added with a small laugh. Life rarely goes according to plan, Jessica said. Sometimes it offers something better than what we imagined. Outside the window, they could see a group of teenagers arriving for the afternoon coding class, a diverse group chatting and laughing together. Among them was Blake's daughter, who had proudly enrolled in the program when she learned her father was involved. The center opens officially next week, Jessica said, watching the teens. President Trump confirmed he'll be here for the ribbon cutting. Blake nodded. It's going to be quite an event. Neither of them could have predicted how their lives would intersect or how a moment of conflict would lead to such profound change. But as they stood side by side watching the future walk through the doors of the community center, both felt the same certainty. This was just the beginning. The morning of the grand opening arrived with perfect weather, clear blue skies and gentle sunshine that seemed to bless the occasion. News vans lined the street outside the community center, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. A crowd had gathered behind the velvet ropes, people from all walks of life, hoping to witness a moment of unity in a time when such moments felt rare. Inside, Jessica paced the length of the newly renovated main hall, stopping occasionally to adjust a chair or straighten a banner. The space was transformed. Gone were the scuffed floors and faded walls, replaced by modern facilities that still maintained the welcoming spirit of the original center. Natural light poured through new skylights, illuminating the colorful mural local teenagers had painted along one wall, depicting the neighborhood's past, present, and hopeful future. Nervous? Blake asked, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. He'd arrived early in his dress uniform, medals glinting on his chest. The past 3 months had changed him too. He stood taller now, with a quiet confidence that came from purpose rather than authority. Jessica accepted the coffee gratefully. A little. It's not every day you share a stage with the President of the United States, she smiled. Or a former adversary turned friend. Friend, Blake repeated, nodding. That still surprises me sometimes. Jessica checked her watch. The President's motorcade should be arriving any minute. Are the kids ready? Blake gestured toward the side room where 20 children from the center's programs waited excitedly, rehearsing the short welcome song they prepared. They've been practicing all week. My daughter's more nervous about her solo than I am about my speech. A staff member hurried over. Ms. Reynolds, they're ready for your sound check at the podium. Jessica nodded and started toward the stage, but paused to look back at the transformed space. It's hard to believe this all started with you hassling me in the parking lot, she said with a small laugh. Blake shook his head, the memory no longer painful but transformed into something more like a valuable lesson. Life takes strange turns. An hour later, the hall was filled to capacity. Community members, dignitaries, police officers, and media all quieted as Jessica stepped up to the podium. Welcome, she began, her voice steady and warm. Today marks not just the reopening of a building, but the beginning of a new chapter for our community. She looked out at the diverse faces watching her. 3 months ago, on a morning much like this one, I came here to make a donation. I thought I was just giving money to renovate a building that had meant so much to me growing up. I had no idea I was about to embark on a journey that would change my life and, hopefully, many others. Jessica paused, finding Blake's face in the crowd, then President Trump sitting in the front row. What happened that morning could have ended very differently. An argument. Anger. Maybe even worse. Instead, thanks to an unexpected intervention and the willingness of everyone involved to listen rather than just react, we found a path forward. She gestured toward the stage. I'd like to invite Officer Blake Thompson to join me. Blake made his way through the crowd and up the steps. He stood tall beside Jessica, no longer the defensive officer from that fateful morning, but a man transformed by his willingness to grow. And President Donald Trump, whose unexpected appearance that day helped change the course of events. Trump joined them on stage, shaking both their hands warmly before stepping to the microphone. What a beautiful place, he began, looking around the hall. And what a remarkable story. He turned to Jessica and Blake. I've seen a lot in my years in business and politics, but watching these two turn a moment of conflict into a national movement for understanding, that's something special. The audience applauded, and Trump continued. I was just passing through that morning, heading to a breakfast meeting. Sometimes the most important moments happen when we least expect them. When I saw what was happening, I didn't stop to think. I just knew I needed to step in. He stepped back, gesturing for Blake to take the microphone. Blake cleared his throat, looking out at his fellow officers in the crowd. "I made a mistake that morning," he said simply. A mistake built on assumptions I didn't even realize I was making. But being wrong turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. He smiled slightly. Not that I'd recommend my approach. A gentle laugh rippled through the audience. "This program we've built together has already changed hundreds of lives, mine included. We're teaching officers to see the people they serve as individuals with stories, not as potential threats. And we're helping communities see the men and women behind the badges as people too, with their own hopes and fears." Blake stepped back, and Jessica moved forward again. "Today, as we cut the ribbon on this renewed center, we're also launching the National Dialogue Initiative, which will bring our program to 50 cities across the country in the coming year." The applause was thunderous. In the front row, Blake's daughter beamed with pride at her father. Beside her sat Blake's former partner, who had initially been skeptical but had recently signed up to join the program himself. As the three of them, Jessica, Blake, and President Trump, stood together with the oversized ceremonial scissors, ready to cut the ribbon stretched across the entrance to the new computer lab, a photographer called out, "Can you move closer together?" They did, shoulders touching in a physical representation of the bridges they'd built. The camera flashes captured the moment. Three people from different worlds, brought together by chance, now united in purpose. "On three," Trump said, and they counted together before the scissors sliced through the ribbon. The crowd cheered, and for that moment, at least, the divisions that so often separated people seemed to fade away. In their place was a simple truth that Jessica voiced as they walked into the lab together. When we take the time to truly see each other, anything is possible.